we live in a radically different, altered consciousness by the very features of our modernity. Yoga needs to take that seriously. I think rather than simply reach into the past and lay claim to some nostalgic sense that what we've lost is their greatness. Well, they had greatness. Now, how do we bring that greatness into our lives? That strikes me as a much more challenging and interesting task.
Namaste. You're listening to the Savannah Podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SavannahSpirit.com, where you can find a large selection of Om and yoga clothing, spiritual jewelry, and unique fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now here's your host, Ashton Sabo.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Savannah Podcast. You are listening to part 2 of a 3-part conversation with scholar, teacher, and yogi, Douglas Brooks, who's professor of religion at the University of Rochester in New York State. We pick up where we left off in episode 51, where we began to ask what it means to be a modern Western yogi in the world today. How can we integrate the experiences we're having? What role can yoga play in our lives? And how can we make yoga adaptable to our modern lives while still honoring these ancient traditions? Let's explore these questions and more as we join in now with our conversation with Professor Douglas Brooks. One of the things that I see as troublesome, and I'll say this even, finding ways to integrate this all the time myself is definitely something that is a challenge, is that where do we learn to integrate that experience of acceptance, or even on a very practical, we can kind of keep the more lofty spiritual ideas. You and I were having a conversation a few weeks or a couple months ago, and you had said something like, I don't want to sound like a cynic, but this is the way that these young students are, something to that effect, where your experience had led you to the understanding like, hey, this is kind of the way the world is operating, where it's like, the dude abides, like it's all good, that kind of mentality of like, this is just the way that it is. And how do you, because I know that the tradition, and we've spoken about this as well, how there's room for this, where how do we fit that into an infinite world where anything is possible, where, there's Zen stories where...
I'm not sure anything is possible.
Okay.
And I think that's an important lesson, I think, that originates in even the most contemplative forms of early yoga traditions that are very much a part of the ascetical traditions of withdrawal, dissociation, abnegation of the temporal realities, pratfalls, we're limited, mortal, and conditioned. Even when we go back to the earliest sources, what they're really telling us is that their usual claim is that our somatic self is limited, and in some sense, our spiritual goal is not. That meme, I think, continues to inform contemporary yoga, because those are the voices that predominated when the West began to hear these traditions, and they have dominated in India as well. We have far less about the kinds of yogas that would re-engage us in a world of possibilities where the mortal condition is not something to transcend, but provides more than the terms and methods of some goal. That when you hear someone say, oh, it's all good or it's all one, you're asking to be sort of exempted. You're asking to be extricated, or you're asking in some sense to get a pass over this really messy business of being human. And I think that it's fair to say that a good bit of the history of yoga's religiosity and its spirituality has made exactly that claim. It's offered you an alternative way of addressing this mixed up, muddled up, shook up world. And by saying, well, there really is a radically alternative human experience. But notice it's one then that comes from traditions of extrication, like we got to get out of this place if it's the last thing we ever do. And those, I submit to you, are but a fraction of the yoga traditions that on the that offer a rather contrary point of view, and my teacher's point of view being, I would suggest, among the most contrary points of view, which is that everything that we want from a human life includes this messy and complicated world of nature and culture and conscience that's going to invariably implicate us in all kinds of unhappy human scenarios, and that to include difficult situations of human life is to become the yogi. I would submit to you that's a rather alternative view from the dominant meme that has said, well, yoga offers an access to a non-rational place that exempts you or gives you some special place where you can go to get a kind of spiritual relief from a world that's otherwise simply defined as suffering.
Well, and that's something that I think I really appreciate the perspective, and I want to continue to flesh out a little here, because I think there's so much of the aversion to people having a hard time with a difficult conversation where people are butting heads or there's friction, and say, well, that's not spiritual. Even though these traditions have tons of debate traditions,
that's so ironic about that.
Yeah.
Is that and to be kind to anyone who makes that kind of remark,
yeah.
But it reveals that they've actually never studied the material,
right?
Because the traditions,
because it's debate all throughout all the traditions all the time.
Yeah. And it's not only debate; it's merciless, ruthless candor. Yeah. It's arduous argument. It's committed to having an incredibly serious conversation. The only way in which tolerance factors into that is the willingness to entertain conflicting points of view. So the fabled tolerance of India is really, sure, we'll let you into the debate. We're happy to have your alternative point of view, and then we're going to ream you a new one.
That's right. To be spiritual doesn't mean you, or for whatever that, I know it's a big, huge rabbit hole, but in the sense of, we're not here to accept everything as in agree with every other alternative point, but we can accept it as okay, I understand that's there and I can hear it. That doesn't mean I'm going to agree with it.
No, quite the contrary.
Yeah.
There is no tradition of Indian philosophy of any writer. And remember, all the philosophers are considered, as it were, paradigmatic, saintly, archetypal. They're all considered sort of the people who got it, who got whatever that particular tradition assigns its goal to be. When you talk about Chandrakirti or Nagarjuna in the Buddhist tradition of the middle way, the Madhyamaka, they're not just philosophers. They are emblematic of the goal of the tradition. And these folks think that there is a decidedly correct point of view. What makes India interesting is that everyone, in a certain sense, has their own orthodoxy, their own. Remember, the word orthodoxy means correct views or correct words. And what you really see that yoga traditions share is the idea that everyone's orthodoxy is almost always radically different. Where yoga traditions converge is in orthopraxy. Orthopraxy is correct practice. So what you really see, let me give you a simple example just to make this point. If we could envision the kinds of methods and practices, especially assigned to early forms of meditation, like if we put Patanjali's Yoga Sutra next to a near contemporaneous Buddhist text on mindfulness, we would, something from the Pali Canon, the Sutta Nipata or something like that, we would find an amazing amount of agreement about what yogis look like, about what they do, about their practices. There's much to be said, for example, about the way Buddhaghosa decides what pranayama is in the path of purity, in the Visuddhimagga. This is a 4th century Buddhist text. Well, if you compare that Buddhist text to early descriptions of commentaries on the Yoga Sutra, you would find that the methods that they're talking about for somatic practice, meditation, concentration, samadhi, different kinds of physical practices, you wouldn't be able to tell one from the other. But when you ask, what's the content of samadhi? Like, what are you supposed to get? What's the end game? What's the orthodoxy? They would all be in profound disagreement. So they agreed in methods and practices, very often more than they agreed in goals, in ideologies, in experiential claims. So they were doing a lot of the same things, but they were not agreeing upon what they meant or where they took you or what this led to.
Well, and I'd like to actually flesh something out that kind of fits in with that. And you've mentioned Buddhism, you've mentioned the Shiva Sutras and Patanjali, and they all have their own kind of insights. I mean, the Shiva Sutras are organized in books, we could say, that kind of point to this. In Buddhism, there's concept of like prajna and pratibha and medha, and Patanjali has his different ideas of samadhi. For people that are starting to have these, again, we won't say beyond experiences, but an experience that doesn't fit into the rational mindset that one in Western culture doesn't really do much to explain. You see, and this is a side topic per se, but you also have a lot of people working with plant medicines these days and things like that. And people are having these profound insights. Or let's even say they're going to a weekend workshop and they're yelling and they're screaming, they're doing some cathartic work, and they unleash their anger that they've been holding on to for years. And they get done and it's like, oh, well, I've let go of my anger now, or I've had an awakening. And it seems that they think that like there's an arrival at that point. And then it leads to a lot of traps. What I'd like to talk about from the perspective of some of these traditions is, how is that described in terms of those different layers or stages of experience where it's like, hey, just because you went to Burning Man and did this thing and had this profound experience doesn't mean you're enlightened, doesn't mean you've got life figured out.
I think that let's start with a critique, and that is that if the Indian traditions in particular, and I would extend this into their long reach, have a foible or make a claim that I think my teacher thought was deeply problematic, it was any claim of finality, and that somehow like this experience that was cathartic or enlivening or life changing was going to be complete, was going to be final. And the critique is well founded. All of the words in Sanskrit for fulfillment, purnam, perfection, siddha, perfection, accomplishment. Even the word Buddha means enlightened. It's a past participle. That means it's a final state. And that, I think, is misleading and, in fact, incorrect. So that would be the first part of the critique. And let me carry on for just a second. And the second would be that these are largely traditions that didn't mean to integrate and include the problematics of our lives. They meant to erase, eradicate, and transcend. As if you could like go, okay, I've had these issues in my life. Now I've practiced meditation, or I've gone to Burning Man and I've achieved this cathartic result, and that's gone. That's over. And that I think was the second critique my teacher raised, which is that's nonsense. Yeah. You're always going to take with you your wound, your shadow. And we need those stories too, and we've got them. They just haven't really been studied very much in the West, or studied very much in India either, because the Indians, like the rest of us, wish that when we got the answer, whatever we think that is, or when we arrive at some conclusive cathartic experience, that we're done with that. Like, that's over. We've got that, move on. Now I'm relieved of that suffering. That the Buddhists use the word nirvana. And that means extinction. And they mean to extinguish the problematic. And I think that, to be really honest, is fundamentally false. We don't extinguish our problematics. We learn to address them. We learn to include them. We learn to become part of them. We have to know when to open and close that closet that's filled with skeletons and shadows, and know when to take them out and when to put them away. And that's a rather different kind of model. But for the process of learning how to take a cathartic or important self-transformative experience is not only to learn how to to address, the wonder and the beauty and the cathartic, elevating sense of ourselves, but not to allow that to somehow diminish the importance of what we think we solved. Those problematics behind that. Like I went to Burning Man, I was a mess, but I came back a different person. Well and good. I'm so happy you came back a different person. Now let's look back and through the integration of all of the self, including all of those wounds and sufferings that you are now perhaps even better empowered to address. Okay, great. You're meditating. You're drawing out this material. You're arriving at a richer, non-rational, contemplative place where your heart and your body and your mind are giving you a radical affirmation. They're giving you a good sign that like life is filled with wondrous possibility. But let's not forget that that doesn't erase or extricate you from the whole of your being. Now, the traditions talked about these as samskaras, imprints or vasanas, fragrances. I love that early term, for our past unhappy experience. Vasana is the word fragrance. And it was literally like your consciousnness, your body, your being has been kind of rubbed on and with a fragrance. And the notion is, of course, it all smells bad. And the idea is think of how we use that word in English. It's kind of funny, when you say like it smells, you usually don't mean it smells good. Apparently not really what you're saying. And the yoga traditions were pretty clear about that they wanted to like rub this stuff off. They wanted to like purify, bathe, get rid of. Now remember too, any tradition that's fundamentally rooted in a purity paradigm, like I'm going to arise to this place where I'm Teflon, where I'm pure, where this no longer attaches itself or lays claim to me. All purity paradigms are invitations to failure. Mm-hmm. If you eat breakfast, you're hungry by lunch. If you bathe today, I promise you, I would be really happy if you bathe tomorrow.
So how do people that have been bombarded with that type of thinking that are coming to yoga and they're thinking, well, to be a yogi, you have to drive a Prius, you have to eat vegetarian, you have to think this, like there's this uber purity to it all. How do people start to integrate these other perspectives like you're talking about without like having to throw out the whole baby with the bathwater? Like how do these two things start to speak to one another?
Well, I'd first suggest that in the greatness of yoga, there's the acknowledgement, even as we take seriously the traditions of karma, progressive causality and accumulation of ourselves, that we each came out differently. We came out with different needs and hopes and expectations, and so similarly our bodies. So what might be healthy? If we think of purity as health or rejuvenation, or if we think of purity as wellness or as some sense of choosing one thing over another, making some kind of asking ourselves what difference this difference makes, then I think we first gain a greater tolerance and insight that what one person is eating is different than what another person is eating because maybe it serves them better. And I think that yoga begins with the acknowledgement that we have different needs. We're different kinds of people. We didn't all come out same. And I think as soon as we attach sameness to everything, everyone must do, then it becomes a world of obligations and dictums, and it's a very short step to a kind of fascism. Everyone should do the same thing. And so every time you say should and ought, take a big breath, like pause. Try not to use that word so exclusively and so determinatively to impose your will on others. But then I'd also say, we live in a world where toxicity is the ordinary state of affairs. So rather than thinking you're going to kind of extricate or eliminate or get yourself out of toxicity, you sort of address, well, what kind of toxicity is helpful, empowering, useful? Like every medicine, whether it's Indian or allopathic, Western medicine, every medicine comes with a counterindication. Every food includes a process of toxicity and purification. So we want to assimilate the things that are somehow good for us, and we want to aver the things that are somehow unwanted or unhealthy. And yet there's no way in which that process is, first, the same for everyone, and secondly, ever going to be completed or ever going to be kind of final. And then, and be careful, I would suggest, in every respect, to not impose necessarily your own views on others. But to that matter, I think that we can take, the greatness of the yogas of the past, which really acknowledged, purity is a theory of difference. Here, not there. This, not that. Now, not then. And in a now, not then, let me give you an example. I presided at a rather beautiful wedding this past weekend, and there was raise a glass of champagne to the new married couple. Well, is there toxicity in the champagne? Can it be mild? Can it be intoxicating? Can you make yourself a mess? Yeah. But is it also celebratory and lovely and a way of acknowledging in a common ritual moment, the wine, the intoxication of their love, of their marriage? Is there a symbolic process to this? There's lots of ways to talk about how we can celebrate being alive and how we can acknowledge the problematics that come with the mortal coil.
Well, and you touch on this idea, and it's really spoken to a lot in Indian stories, is drinking the poison and transmuting it to make it your nectar, where we have this idea that poison is poison, like it's some fixed idea thing, like, oh, alcohol is poison. But it's like you're saying, there's that way to integrate it.
There's not only stories about suspending the poison and not assimilating the poison so that nourishment can happen. There's also stories about how nourishment is poison. So when the ocean of milk, when the universe is churned at its beginning and its recursive end, there's a great story about a demon who is. And the demons and the gods conspire to churn this milky ocean. And the demons are pulling from the head of the great serpent Vasuki, and the gods are pulling from the tail. And this is a very famous story. It's called Samanta Mantra, the churning of the milky ocean. You can find it. It's retold in the Ramayana, the Mahabharata. It's retold in the epics, as well as in the Puranas, many, many places. And there are a zillion versions and variants on the story. But that serpent, of course, is our spiritual self, who is churning from the bottom of our own being, of our own consciousness, a milky ocean. And the gods and the demons have agreed that they both want to churn, because all kinds of things will emerge out of that ocean, all kinds of possibilities. And at the bottom of that ocean, just to make your point and to carry the conversation forward, there are two distinctive things that emerge from that ocean. The first is the most coveted and desired of things, and that's the amrita, that's the nectar, that's the nourishment. Amrita is literally deathlessness, right? Amrita, so mrita will take you, mritu in Sanskrit, all the way to the English word mortal, like having a mortgage, engaged until death. Right? So amrita is without mortality. It's the deathless nectar. It's the coveted elixir that's going to emerge from the milky ocean, right? And the gods and the demons both want it. And the gods are determined to make sure that the demons don't get it. The demons are determined to have it. Well, in that process, to make, as it always is in India, a very long story much shorter, the demon Rahu Ketu gets a sip of the amrita, and at the very moment he gets a sip, he is decapitated. And so that nectar, which leaves now his head, which has sipped the immortal, is decapitated from the rest of his being. And he is, in some sense, doomed to wander the cosmos in perpetual pursuit of the rest of his self, which has, of course, been decapitated by the gods. It was usually Vishnu, who's the savior of the gods, who prevents the demons from having the amrita. And so what is the immortal nourishment to the demons is in fact their bane. It ends up being their toxicity. Rahu's head survives. The rest of his being goes to the netherworlds, and he causes eclipses by trying to swallow the moon, which is the soma, another emblem of this elixir of the most cherished, purifying, nourishing, immortal drink. Now, the other thing, of course, that comes out of the Milky Ocean is the halahal. That's a great word in Sanskrit. It's halahal. It's the onomatopoetic sound of choking, right? So it's the opposite of the elixir amrita. This is the nourishing thing. But the halahal is the toxicity. It's the poison. So halahal is, it's the sound of not being able to swallow, right? It's the sound, see, like I said, it's the onomatopoetic sound of poison, of gagging. Now, to that end, even the gods don't know what to do. And eventually they give it to the yogi. They give it to Shiva. And rather than swallow it and assimilate it, and rather than leave it unattended, he puts it in his throat, right? This is the very famous story of how Shiva's throat turns blue. He's called Nilakanta, blue-throated, right? And he suspends the poison in his throat. But notice that, and this, of course, is then usually retold, interpreted to say, well, don't assimilate the toxicities, be like Shiva, or in a more theistic sense, Shiva saved us by taking this poison that would otherwise be ruinous to the recreation of the world and protecting us from it. Well, I would prefer a different interpretation of that toxicity, which is to make us every character in the story.
Which is truly how we interpret myth if we're viewing myths kind of more inclusively anyways, which is a lot of what we do on the story.
Don't think myths are about us and about nature and about our own experience of ourselves. If we're not every character in the story, then what are they about? Then you're left only with the pejorative sense of that's a myth, meaning it's a falsehood, or that myth is true. Now you're left with some silly superstitious thing. That there was once a god who swallowed poison who saved us from the world. Or he rose from the dead. Pick your literalism and myth becomes the pejorative term that we use it. There's almost no use of the word myth in our common parlance that in any way recaptures its truest value, which is to tell us more about ourselves than the facts, right? Myth is an access to those experiences and thoughts, to the unconscious. Myth is a way of talking about ourselves when the facts won't suffice. We need to tell a story, right? So in this story, I would like to think that we all suspend the poison. We learn not to become the poison or the shadow, but we also learn not to deny it. We know we've got to drink it. We're never going to really get rid of it. Shiva's throat stays blue. And yet, if we become Rahu, and we decapitate ourselves from the world, from the body, from the somatic other half of ourselves, if we're just a head, and yet we drink that elixir of nourishment, that purity, we drink the amrita, right, thinking we're going to be immortal, and we will wander the world dissociated from the body, right, from Rahu Ketu, from Ketu is the other half of Rahu. And what's happened? He's lost his body. He's lost his connection to himself and the world. So if we nourish ourselves but lose our connection to the world, we're going to wander the world thinking that we've got the immortal. But in fact, we're just Rahu, aimlessly wandering, looking for the next immortal elixir. If we don't take the poison, on the other hand, and put it some way inside ourselves, and then hold it in a meaningful way, and then use it to some advantage, then perhaps we haven't taken seriously this beautiful problematic and this paradox of being human, that we can have the joys and wonders and non-rational empowerments of the gifts of a human consciousness in this world. But it's also going to have to come with the idea that it comes at a cost, and it comes with implications. And it comes with consequences. And if you think it's all nourishing, you'll end up the demon Rahu. And if you think that it's all poison, you won't have the nerve to be Shiva and suspend it, take it back in, re-assimilate it. There's a lot of things we can cull from these stories. And that's another reason I think that not only we should tell these stories, but we should try to learn more about how they inform our everyday lives. Well, how are these still pertinent? That's the question of the modern yogi. It isn't long ago and far away these ancient people knew something. Sure, why? Why not? Why not? And so there were dinosaurs too. It's so what? It's so what does what they knew impact us today? What do these stories have to tell us about ourselves? That was always my teacher's strategy too. He wasn't willing to say, long ago and far away, the great ones got it. And then you're left with Harry met Sally met the Buddha. Like, I'll have what he's having. I want to replicate that ancient yoga experience. Well, that's nonsense. You're not only not going back in time, you're claiming there's this perennial experience. Good luck with that. But you're also not, but we also have to take seriously that there's been progress and we live now. And we have to say to ourselves, well, what does this matter to me given the world I'm living in? Because communication is instantaneous. We're doing this over a podcast. We know 200 years ago, it took 2 months to get a letter from, Washington to Boston. We live in a radically different, altered consciousness by the very features of our modernity. Yoga needs to take that seriously. And I think rather than simply reach into the past and lay claim to some nostalgic sense that what we've lost is their greatness. Well, they had greatness. Now, how do we bring that greatness into our lives? That strikes me as a much more challenging and interesting task.
That concludes part 2 of our 3-part conversation with Professor Douglas Brooks. I hope you'll join in with us on the next episode where we continue and conclude our conversation of the modern yogi living in the world. I hope you all have a present moment, and I hope you'll join us for the next episode. Namaste. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to the show today. Please go over to iTunes, write a review, let us know what you think. It helps us in creating new content for all of you. It also helps new listeners get a sense of what to expect from the show. We really appreciate your feedback. Thanks again for listening. Namaste.
You've been listening to the Savannah Podcast. To find out more about Savannah, go to savannahspirit.com or follow Savannah on Facebook at facebook.com/Savannah Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at savannaeast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Savannah Podcast.